Buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Felipe Medina y soy presidente del Consejo de la Aspen Institute en Colombia. El Aspen Institute es una organización reconocida por más de 70 años de experiencia, reuniendo a líderes provenientes de diferentes contextos e impulsándolos a desarrollar iniciativas que contribuyen a la construcción de una buena sociedad. La iniciativa del Instituto Aspen Colombia es un espacio seguro y apartidista donde líderes colombianos pueden compartir perspectivas divergentes enmarcadas en conversaciones constructivas y pragmáticas. Ahora voy a pasar a inglés. It is a pleasure to host Jacqueline Novogratz, CEO of Acumen and trustee of the Aspen Institute, in this virtual conversation. I first heard about Jacqueline in 2000 when a professor from Universidad San Andrés in Argentina told me that I had to meet this exceptional lady that worked at the Rockefeller Foundation. I have followed her trajectory for the last 20 years, and she never ceases to impress me with her ability to think out of the box. 4 years ago, I had the privilege of being invited to be part of the advisory council of Acumen and have gotten to see her work more closely. When she published her book, I thought it would be very important for Colombian leaders to listen to her ideas. So it's a pleasure to welcome you to Colombia virtually. I know you would love to be sitting in Bogota. Jacqueline did her undergraduate at University of Virginia. She has an MBA from Stanford. And then after working in Wall Street, she was inspired to really create a microcredit organization and then worked for the Rockefeller Foundation. And then in 2001, she started Acumen. She has been selected as one of the world's 100 living business minds by Forbes magazine. So it is truly a pleasure to have you with us, Jacqueline. She is going to be interviewed by Juanita Leon. Juanita is known to most of you. She's the founder and director of La Silla Vacía, leading digital news site in Colombia. She also has ample experience in both as a writer and then as a reporter in working for several publications. So I'm going to let Juanita get started, and thank you very much again for being with us, Jacqueline.
Thank you, Felipe, for this introduction. And Jacqueline, it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you, and it's a great pleasure to talk to a lot of friends from the Aspen Institute and to help in some ways with this amazing center. So Jacqueline, I read your book. I would love to be able to discuss with you about it. Some of the people that are listening to us read it. Other people didn't have the chance to read it. So I would like to go with you a little bit along the book. And I would love to start with the idea of the love letter. You say that your book is a love letter to future generations. I would say that it is also a love letter for my generation. So I am curious about the idea of the love letter. Why did you think the book like that?
Well, thank you, Juanita. And just before I answer that question, to say thank you so much to Felipe and to Aspen Institute Colombia, actually a trustee of Aspen Global. And so to see the work that Bryn and Felipe and many of you have done to bring Aspen to Colombia is so exciting. And already between Juanita, yours and Felipe's warmth makes me miss being in Colombia even more. So just to say thank you for being here. The love letter, you know, for me, after 20 years of really building Acumen and 35 years of doing the work of essentially trying to use tools of the market without being controlled by the market to solve problems of poverty, when I step back to think about what would I say now? as somebody who has really benefited from many mentors and knowing literally thousands of change makers across the world, that we're in a moment of history where we are pretty clear that our existing institutions and systems have run their course, yet we've not reimagined with what to replace them. And so I thought about what I had learned and how could I pass on the lessons in terms of principles that people had handed to me or that I'd learned the hard way to a new generation who were going to have to create new institutions by renewing those values and renewing those principles. And that's what this book turned out to be.
Jacqueline, you talk a lot about moral imagination, moral rejuvenation. You talk that we need a moral rejuvenation. And that's a little bit of a complicated concept. So I would love you to expand on it. What do you mean about this idea of creating like a new set of values?
So, you know, for too long, we have focused on one definition of success: money, power, fame. And the moral rejuvenation that we're talking about is really moving from those systems that put profit only at the center of our systems to those that put our shared humanity and the sustainability of the earth at the center. That is going to be really hard work to do. And so the moral imagination in many ways infuses all of it. It's at the beginning. Too many of us use the lens only of our own imagination, even when we're designing systems for people whose lives are completely unlike our own. And this moment of COVID has really exposed what the world looks like when we don't design in ways that include the poor and the earth. And so moral imagination demands that we do what we can to put ourselves in the shoes of others, build from that perspective. And importantly, to see other human beings as fully equal, as part of ourselves, neither above or below us, not idealizing nor victimizing them. And that demands immersing ourselves in who they are and in the problems that they face so that we can analyze the structures that get in their way and also be honest about where they might be holding themselves back. And so that's the moral imagination. And what's been so thrilling in working with Acumen in Colombia is to see a new generation of entrepreneurs who are building businesses infused with that moral imagination and I believe starting to teach the world a reimagined way of how we can apply capitalism in a very, very different way to solving our problems.
Yeah, I love that you use that concept because it is a concept that writers use a lot, no? Moral imagination to write, to be able to write a novel or to develop a character. And I understand that you say that it is a skill that you develop. And I see reading your book that you have traveled all over the world, that you talk to the cacao growers in Colombia, you talk to the people in Vietnam. How can you develop that skill without traveling so much? Because most of the people that are listening to us, well, they have a business that they have to attend to. So how could they develop that without necessarily going all over the world?
Juanita, first of all, thank you for pushing on this idea that it is a skill. And I would actually say it's a very hard skill. That in this moment of great interdependence, where we are facing such tectonic shifts, we need a whole new skill set that we have not really practiced. We haven't exercised those muscles for too long. Moral imagination, I would say, starts with deep listening from a place of inquiry, not certainty. When we think about so many of our leaders right now, they're shouting from a place of certainty. They know the answers rather than practicing, sitting particularly across lines of difference to hear things that might be very uncomfortable. We may not want to hear it. I would say that the moral imagination is also based on learning from people like you, Juanita, the writers, the storytellers. When I had never left the United States, but was reading the works of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, suddenly a world was open to me that was completely different than the world that I had seen around my own world. And that sparked my moral imagination as well, to want to get closer, to want to learn. And so I don't think you have to travel, but you do have to listen, you do have to pay attention, and you do have to recognize your own privilege when speaking with people who don't have it, and spend more time listening than talking, which isn't always easy to do.
Yeah, I find it very interesting that although you are talking about changing the world, you are also talking about, or you are working with corporate, also, you come from a corporate world, you talk to entrepreneurs, you talk about markets, about customers, and those worlds sometimes seem so far apart. And even when you talk about active listening, you are also talking even from the market. So how do you reconcile both worlds?
I actually think that this is our worlds. And something has happened over the last 20, 30 years where we are allowing language and identity to keep us apart from each other. When I worked in Rwanda in the early 1980s, the marketplace was a place where people had no money, but they would barter, they would exchange goods. That is what we do as human beings. Yet suddenly at some point, market itself became a dirty word. Marketing became an uncomfortable word. And so if we can get away from the words and actually focus on the shared humanity, we start to see that not only all of our systems have these elements within them, but that we have got to move away from ideology and recognize that for us to succeed in this next chapter of our history, we have to start by recognizing the problems that we want to solve for the most vulnerable. And then we have to recognize that we all play a part in solving it. So if we just drink a cup of coffee in the morning, it may seem like an easy, innocent act, but it is connected to markets, it's connected to supply chains, it's connected to climate change. Importantly, it's connected to some of the lowest income people on the earth who do the work of growing that coffee cherries that become the coffee beans that then get roasted, and same with chocolate. And that is again where our work in Latin America has taught us so much, Juanita.
Jackie, in each chapter, you explore a specific practice or a specific skill that people should develop in order to have this moral imagination and in order to change the world, as you talk. And you talk about courage, practicing courage, partnering with humility and with audacity. Which principle have you found more difficult, more challenging in your own practice to acquire?
I would say maybe it's the courage to practice all of them, because they are all about living more deeply into your own humanity from a place of growing your character and your competence. So it isn't just about being a good listener and having moral imagination, it's also building the skills and the tools of confronting the status quo that doesn't want to change, of learning, and this, I think you just made this point so beautifully before, to bridge some of the most vulnerable and some of the most powerful. Probably, Juanita, a quick story from Colombia shows you just how you put all of this together. It starts with an entrepreneur named Carlos Velasquez, who was working in the coffee industry. And he partnered with a Japanese cacao whisperer named Mayumi Ogata, who really wanted to see what was possible in Colombia after 50 years of conflict, to reclaim the high quality of Colombian chocolate. And so recognized that the best cacao was in the post-conflict areas like Tumaco, like in the Sierra Nevada, and had to build the moral imagination and the skills to partner with groups like the Arhuaco in the Sierra Nevada. And so had a lot of competencies about how the coffee and then the chocolate industry functioned, but to partner with groups like the Arhuacos to approach from a place of deep listening, to have the courage to recognize that they were going to have to create more of a covenant almost than a transactional contract. And then to partner with groups like Acumen as an investor and trust that we would really focus not just on extracting profits, but that we would look at what we could contribute to the partnership as well. We partnered with USAID, a government entity that was also really interested in being part of the solution in ways that made sense, yes, from a market perspective and from a human perspective. And so it's all these different skills that had to come together to create a profitable, viable company that respected the indigenous philosophy that put the sustainability of the earth at the center of community, that created a high quality chocolate that could be exported to the world in ways that not only created a commercial viability, but also allowed the Arhuacos to export their philosophy, that we can actually do business completely different as a way of promoting peace, not just making money. That's a big skill set. But that is a skill set that we need to bring into our corporations, into our nonprofits, into our government, certainly into our political leaders. And so they're all hard to practice, and yet they're deeply what it means to become, I think, the kind of human beings we must become in our interdependent world. It demands that of us. I also think it's the path to the deepest level of meaning.
And I think it's very interesting how in each of the stories that you tell, you never have the approach of how to make people better off. No, it's really something very interconnected between you growing as a person and the other person growing with you. I think that's a very interesting approach. And regarding purpose, you say that sometimes people are seeking for a sense of purpose, and that is not easy to do it, especially when you say, well, there are so many things to change in the world, so how do I do it? And you just say, just start, let the work teach you. You don't plan your way into finding your purpose, you live into it. I would love to hear a little bit more about that, and how do you do that? Because it sounds easier than it is.
Well, you know, the Jesuits have a saying, go to where the world's deepest need meets your greatest yearning. And so I actually am a believer that all around us are enormous opportunities that are just disguised as big, ugly problems to solve. And so too many of us start with, who am I? What's my purpose? In a way that's more about our own ego, rather than seeing something that needs changing in the world and moving toward it, not necessarily knowing what we're going to do to solve it. I know that Samuel Azud is on the line, and after having a very successful career in retail, he saw the situation of young boys and girls in Barranquilla and other parts of the country with nothing really to do. And so he started a sports league, but in a way that would help them not only become more occupied, but better citizens and indeed business people. And so I don't think Sammy understood what he was doing once he started, but the work started to teach him. And what set him apart is that he made the decision to move. Virgilio Barco, who runs Acumen Latin America, is such a curious human being that he, more than any of the country directors, will call me and say, okay, you may not like this idea, but I've seen this possibility. Let me try it. I'm thinking about trying it. He doesn't ask permission. I'm thinking about trying it. And what excites me, Juanita, is to be able to work with a person of integrity that won't go in thinking he has the answers, but seeing a problem that could be solved with the specific school tool set that we might have to offer. And I guess the hard part isn't just starting. The hard part is knowing that you might make mistakes and starting anyway. Because if we rule out failure we rule out the possibility of success. And so I think we think the hard part is just putting ourselves out there. I actually think that what gets in our way is that we're afraid of not being perfect. We're afraid of letting someone down. We're afraid of failing. And those are real fears. But the only way that we conquer them is to practice falling down. And that comes back to just starting. But it's not something we only do once. We do it over and over and over. And at Acumen, we're still just starting. And I personally, in this time of COVID, am definitely just starting.
Jackie, I think one of the things that we have seen during these very weird times of COVID is that the privilege that we have has become so notorious, you know, like the gap between the people that have privilege and the people that are not so privileged has become very evident to most of us. How do you deal with your privilege? How do you make that privilege not paralyze you and feel that, you know, because a lot of us feel that we're privileged, we want to do something, but starting, it's also difficult. Because there's such a gap between us and other people. So how do you bridge that gap? How do you deal with your own privilege in seeking to work with others and to change the inequality in the world?
Well, in a way, I think for me personally, it started in first grade with a nun who said, to whom much is given, much is expected. And so that ethos, can we move away from a golden rule that says, do unto others as we would have them do unto ourselves, to one that says, give back to the world more than we take. And if that's our only metric, are we giving back to the world more than we take, whether it's in a day, whether it's in a year, whether it's in a lifetime? I do believe we start to move differently. If we don't know where to start, there are organizations all around us that do know, and we can support them. Too often we only think about our money, although those organizations need our money. We have to start to think about our privilege in terms of our social networks, who we know. How do we help those who don't have access get access? The way we consume. Are we consuming in ways that might be more expensive, but for people who would not normally get access? Again, this is where I actually think that Colombia has a real opportunity in this moment, because the country is small enough and yet has such incredible skills and such incredible financial resources to build a different kind of ecosystem. When I think about Cacao de Colombia as one example, it's been thrilling to watch Virgilio, our country director, use his social contacts through Luis Gallo, Samuel Azut, the other Felipe Medina, the other Acumen partners, to then work with Crepes and Waffles to take a bet on a startup company and build out that ecosystem. This is this idea again that it's going to take all of us, and we can't just live in silos. It's the government, it's the private sector, it's the NGO or charitable sector. How do we build sometimes uncomfortable networks, communities, which means we have to hear uncomfortable things, but in ways that privilege the unprivileged, that privilege the excluded. And that means we have to shift our mindset and can't be thinking that, well, if it's a business and I don't make money, then it doesn't mean anything. Rather that I have an opportunity with my privilege to help a group of excluded people build a company where they might earn assets, where they might move to profitability. And that's the shift we have to make. And that's the moral imagination, but it's not, again, soft. We want to build long-term profitable companies that serve the poor, not just the wealthy.
Jackie, I find it very interesting that you talk more about character than about leadership. No, people are so used to hearing about becoming a good leader, leadership, but you talk a lot about character. What's the difference between both concepts?
Juanita, you are definitely a good journalist. I love it. I would say, sometimes at Acumen, we say, we don't need another hero. We need a million heroic acts. And so often we, in the last few decades, when you and I were growing up, we would look at that one leader, that one entrepreneur, and we would put that person on a pedestal. And in a way, when we call someone a leader, it's almost like the beginning of the end. What we need to develop in all of ourselves is a strength of character, a character that is grounded in the idea that we are here to serve others, not just ourselves, that we are here to find those solutions where we're not living in a place where I can only win if you lose, but that we create solutions together where all of us can flourish. And so when I look across the world, I see some real leaders, but I'm very careful in terms of the language that I use. I look at a Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand and how she is handling this COVID crisis, how she is embracing all of the people of New Zealand and not just some of the people, how she's not devolving into blaming and naming. And so for me, life might pay off in terms of short term on risk taking and some of the more skills that we're taught as kids, but the real payoff is the stuff that no one can take away from us, and that's all about character.
Jackie, and just to finish, you at the end of your book, you urge your readers to write their own manifestos. Why is that, and how do you write a manifesto?
Well, what is a manifesto except for a written statement of values and intentions? At Acumen, we love words. We live our values, or we try to live our values. And at one point, we thought about aspirationally writing down the values that we want to live by, because that is the best that we can do as seekers who are trying to build new institutions when there are no real roadmaps. We're building institutions that have not really existed. And so we started by thinking about what's most important to us. And we've learned over time that particularly if you're working with markets, if you are not intentional that you want those markets to include the poor, they won't. And so the first line of Acumen's manifesto is it starts by standing with the poor. Listening to voices unheard. And so the importance of listening, seeing potential where others see despair. That this work is hard, but it requires a sense of hope. It requires a sense of recognizing what might be, the moral imagination. Our manifesto includes the fact that we see investment as a means, not as an end. In other words, we want to use the tools of business, the tools of capital without being controlled by it. Because for us, success is based on the flourishing of those we are here to serve and the financial sustainability. It doesn't happen overnight. Our manifesto requires that we hold our values in tension, that we have to be generous, yes, but accountable as well. And so by having a statement, I hear it all the time in our investment committee meetings, in our Acumen Fellows, of which there are 40 now in Colombia. I hear it in young people around the world, in the stories that they tell me. And so every family, every individual, every organization certainly can take the time to write down what is your statement of the values that are most important to you, that you want to live by. Because I think if we were more intentional about that, we might be walking more thoroughly on our own paths to character.
Well, Jackie, it is very interesting. I'd love to hear more about your organization. I forgot to ask you about how capital has to be patient, which I think is a great concept that you also develop. And I hope one of the investors in this talk will ask you about it. And with that, I'll give the word to Felipe, who is going to ask you questions and let the people that are listening to us ask you questions themselves.
Well,
So,
Juanita, I just wanted to tell you that it's an honor to be interviewed by you, because you really model the kinds of attributes that we talk about at Acumen in terms of the way you listen in your own moral imagination. So thank you for just this opportunity.
No, thank you. Felipe.
Great. Juanita, thank you very much. That was wonderful. Jacqueline, you know Colombia and you traveled to Colombia. We have had a situation of a very polarized country. And when I was reading your book, I took some notes of some ideas that you mentioned in the book. And wanted to review those notes and see what suggestions would you have for Colombian nationals to apply some of these concepts. You mentioned in your book, assume goodness. When there's tension, can you recognize a truth or a partial truth on what the other one is saying? You also quote Rumi, the 13th century poet, saying, beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field, I will meet you there. And then finally, there's concepts that you talk about learning to navigate, of opposing values, of defend mode and explore mode, and know how you could apply those. Can you expand a little bit on these ideas and how they could apply with the situation that we're living in Colombia?
Yeah, Felipe, and let me just start by saying, as an American, I tread into this territory with great humility, because we also have never seen the United States in such a state of such polarization, where even whether you wear a mask or don't wear a mask is seen as a political statement, and there's a level of divisiveness and fear here. So, and so, you know, when I wrote these words, I didn't quite even understand just where the world would be. But as you know, Felipe, I did a lot of my growing up in Rwanda before the genocide. And there I saw how easy it is in times of insecurity, particularly for bad leaders, demagogic leaders, to prey on the broken parts of ourselves, the insecurities, the grievances, the shames that we feel, and blame other people for wrongdoings, rather than really confront the actual problem itself, and that can lead sometimes to very terrible things. As you said, we've seen it in Colombia. We certainly saw it at an extraordinary level in Rwanda. I also saw Rwanda rebuild itself from the ruins. And so I know that it is possible for human beings to find a different level of ways of communicating and peace. And so luckily in Acumen's work, we practice these skills in less extreme ways, but they are still there in terms of profit and purpose. How do you navigate these conversations in ways that people can hear? You said it in terms of shorthand, rather than saying you're wrong. Can I acknowledge even a partial truth in what you have just said so that I can open a space? Because when I do, you are much more likely to acknowledge something in my truth, and that we might find something not just in the middle, but another field where we could agree. And almost every one of our debates right now, in different countries around the world, are set up as these polarities. Build a wall, open borders. That is not a way to have a conversation about immigration, because neither is a policy that really makes any sense. And so can we actually talk about what is underneath it? And so I would say in Colombia or in America, it's the same we're at the same place, that we're not talking about good people and bad people. My experience is that each of us have monsters and angels inside of us. So what are the systems that can bring out our better angels? How do we build trust, recognizing it is the most rarest currency that we have? It was largely for this, Felipe, that Virgilio and the team decided to build, as you know, because you were part of it, the Acumen Fellows in Colombia. And so this is a program that has a diverse set of young change makers from all parts of the country. In the first year, we had 60% of people who applied for the Acumen Fellowship came from post-conflict areas. And they bring this wealth of not just diversity, but experience, that when you listen to them, that becomes the story of Colombia, that people inside the country and people outside the country don't often get to hear. But even working with people in many cases who've been raised to hate each other, not trust each other, requires time. It requires these skill sets. It requires learning to think about identity not as a tool to divide us from each other, but as a way that we can connect to each other, recognizing that all of us have multiple identities within ourselves. At the very least, as the Acumen Fellows, everyone's Colombian. Then you find that most people love chocolate in the morning. Most, Colombians tend to be able to drink coffee at night, and suddenly you find other parts of identity where people can connect, so that then we can get into the hard things. What worries me about this moment in history, Felipe, is we don't give each other time. And so how do we also build in these opportunities for really hard conversations? This is where Aspen is also so important coming into Colombia. And my hope would be that if you think about these two communities, and I'm part of both, but we brought some of the Cali Fellows, the Central American Aspen Fellows, to help moderate the Good Society, which Aspen does, in the Acumen Fellowship in Colombia. And the moderators were so excited to have an opportunity to really hear in an unfiltered way from Colombians from parts of the country that they'd never known. And so I think there's a real opportunity to bring different communities together across lines of difference, to have very difficult conversations that might start to build a different level of understanding, because we all need to be part of the solutions going forward. And so I appreciate your question, and I also know how tender it is. So thank you.
Thank you. Now I'm going to invite a couple of our board members to also pose a question. Sammy, if you could please come in. And
I think it's Luis just came in. Oh, here's Sammy.
Sammy, and then Luis Gallo will come in. And if in the audience, if you have a question that you would like to pose, you can send it via the messenger board, and we'll try to address those questions at the end of the session. Thank you.
So thank you, Felipe. And Jacqueline, it's such a privilege and an honor to have you with us today. But more than that, it's a real joy. So thank you. And actually, we're all very excited and happy, fortunate also to have Acumen in Colombia and the great work it's doing under the leadership of Virgilio. But we know that your work is very concentrated in Africa, Pakistan, and these distant lands. So my question is, how can you compare, our weaknesses and strengths from a cultural perspective in Colombia? And how does that affect the possibilities of overcoming our social challenges within the framework of moral courage and moral revolution? So how does our cultural differences and similarities with these distant lands affect the level of change that Acumen wants to impact in our societies?
You don't throw easy questions, Sammy. you know, I think it's no surprise to you and who you represent. But the more you know the world, the more that you know that human beings are human beings. So let me just start there. And one of the great opportunities we have in this breaking open that COVID-19 is doing by showing the wounds in all of our systems is showing how much we need to learn from each other. And so the reason we came to Colombia in the first place, and you were responsible for it, so I blame you, is that Acumen had already, as you said, worked in Pakistan, India, East West Africa, and we had learned how to build companies over a 10 to 15 year period of time for people living in absolute poverty, making a few dollars a day. At this point, we've actually reached about 300 million low-income people around the world. We know how to do this using long-term patient capital investing. And so when we were thinking about where do we expand geographically, it struck us that while we understood poverty in an absolute sense, we didn't really understand the poverty of inequality. And so we asked ourselves, well, where would we go in the world to really see that? And Colombia, being one of the most unequal countries in terms of income levels, seemed a real opportunity. You were there. There was a business community. Virgilio was there. And we saw this remarkable entrepreneurial energy in the country. And so the opportunity that Colombia has that other countries don't have is a talent pipeline like very few that exist on the planet. And increasingly there's a generation of entrepreneurs who see that we must actually solve our problems using the tools of business rather than just make money. And so my hope, because I'm seeing some of the more morally creative and imaginative entrepreneurs coming out of Colombia, is that we use it as a model for a reimagined capitalism in the rest of the world. I talked about Cacao de Colombia, but Azahar, which was also supported by philanthropy and the support of USAID, that allowed us to take bets on companies working in post-conflict areas, is started by a guy named Tyler Youngblood, who actually recognized that in the coffee industry, too often the individual farmer just has to accept whatever coffee prices are set at the global commodities level. Often in Colombia, that means that farmers can't even cover the costs of producing the coffee themselves. And so what Azahar does is fix essentially a wage that will allow the farmers to live sustainably, agree to a fixed price so that they can plan their lives, and then build the economic financial model where there's greater transparency, understanding along the supply chain, and customers are happier. Even buyers like Stumptown, which are purchasing from Azahar. This is an important model that the specifics of Colombia allow, because you have talent, you have access to markets, and because of the quality of some of the commodities in the country. And so I actually think that Colombia can rebrand around these kinds of exports for reimagined capitalism. What that takes, though, is that moral imagination, Sami, because 50 years of civil war has left people pulling inward as much as reaching outward. And that's the work. That's the work.
Thank you, Jackie.
Great. I'll invite Luis Gallo now to join us, please.
Yes, Jacqueline, welcome back to Colombia, at least virtually. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you. I can feel the warmth through the screen, though, Luis.
Oh, yeah. We admire you greatly. You've had the chance to work or to talk and interact with some of the poorest families in the world, you know, some of the kids and daughters and sons of the less privileged, but you have also worked and interacted with the sons and daughters of the most privileged. And my question has to do with the fact that our sons and daughters, for the first time in mankind, in history, are threatened with the fact that their house is falling apart, that they might not have a planet in which to live. We, the eldest, don't worry so much because, you know, by the time our time passes, climate change may not affect us as much, but the younger generations do feel that on a day-to-day basis. How do you see them, especially from the privileged sector, in terms of their commitment to give back and to have the character to do things that is going to be required of them to save the planet? What is your sense on that?
Luis, I feel quite hopeful. I do think it's our responsibility as the elders when we see young people, and I think right now, some of the young people are really struggling with COVID, and knowing climate change is right behind it, that I talk to 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds who say, well, Jacqueline, the world is just going to be on fire in 20 years. And so we have to pay attention to some of those young people and make sure that we find ways to get them involved, help them see that change is possible, which is part of the love letter component of this, because I have seen such change happen. More than that, though, Luis, is I'm seeing even 8 and 10-year-olds, you know, yell at me if I have a plastic bag that my sandwich is in. You know, Aunt Jacqueline, don't you know that you're destroying the planet? And they're holding me accountable in those very small acts. And so that actually bodes very well for the future, that you've got a new generation that is starting to see its power, Luis. With Black Lives Matter in the United States, young people are saying enough. Our systems are broken, and they're starting to realize that that they can do things. When you look at Greta Thunberg, one young 16-year-old in Sweden created a complete movement around climate change. And so what makes me hopeful, again, are the new models of capitalism, the circular economy models. One of the ones that I've loved, it was created by a guy named Ankit Agarwal in Kanpur, India, which is in the industrial town along the sacred river Ganges. And he saw, going back to Just Start, he saw all of these, the flowers that he'd seen his whole life floating in the Ganges, when a friend asked, you know, what was going on here? And it seemed to him that they were covered in pesticides and chemicals, which in fact they were. But the way that they got in the Ganges is that every year, Indians throw 8 million metric tons of flowers they give them to the temples as blessings to the gods. Priests turn around and they throw the flowers into the sacred rivers where people go and bathe and get their blessings. And so not only was this ancient practice destroying the rivers, but it was killing people. And so this entrepreneur, using this whole new model of the circular economy, in other words, how can I take waste and convert it into productive use, applied it to this problem. And so daily he picks up the flowers from the temples. He only hires women from the scavenger caste, so the most marginalized people who have had terrible prejudice, to then convert those flowers into incense sticks and vegan leather. And he's built a beautiful company, a profitable company now, based on this whole model. He needed Acumen's patient capital. So philanthropy-backed investment that we could make for a long time, so that he could, and others, we were not the first investor, so that he could actually build a company that that hired the most vulnerable, that cleaned up the rivers, that allowed people the dignity of work in ways that made him proud. We need more role models like that. Going back to this idea of leader, hero, we've been celebrating too many people just because they make a lot of money or they're famous. We need role models that are creating viable models that make all of us proud. And we need business models that we are willing to back, that we are willing to support, whether it's with our charitable money or whether it's with our impact investing or whether it's the way we invest, because our next generation is really telling us how let down they are by us, and they have been let down by us. And that's where I feel really hopeful, Luis, that this is that moment for us to reimagine and recreate in ways that make sense, but for all of us.
Thank you.
Great. Virgilio, can you join us? I think you're in mute.
Hi, Jacqueline.
Hi, Virgilio.
Jacqueline, one of the biggest challenges we face as a society in Colombia after so many years of strife is a breakdown of trust. And I've often heard you say that the scarcest currency is trust, meaning that it's hard to rebuild. Based on your experiences, based on your reflections in the book, what guidance could you give us as Colombians as we try to rebuild trust in our country?
Thanks, Virgilio. I mean, I would actually, you teach me a lot about building trust. The one is we have to show up. We have to go to places where people actually live. You know, one of the things I've learned is that distance dulls the moral imagination. And so if we don't actually take the time to show up and meet people, it's very hard to build trust. And we don't just show up once, we show up many times. And we bring our real selves. We really do start by listening back to that question of privilege. Knowing that when we walk in, the power always exists in a room. And so, you know, sitting on the floor rather than standing up or even getting out of our car, from a place of real humility. Maybe we need a new kind of humility. And then when we make promises, actually keeping them. And why I said, Virgilio, you actually teach me so much. I think about the way that you have worked, whether it's with Gigante Wet Mill, which is, as you know, a coffee, based coffee with an association with about 300 coffee farmers. They didn't even have trust with each other in Huila. And I don't know how many times you and the team showed up to not just create access to markets, but help people build capabilities so that they could interact with markets and with each other and with you. How long did that take you?
You're mute.
Yeah, a year, 2 years.
Just to get to the starting block. Just to get to the starting block. And then structuring financials in such a way that over time, when they pay us back, they will own the company. All of that takes time. All of that takes being true to your word. What I've also been struck by the way you all build trust is that it's, you're the same person, whether you're talking to some of the wealthiest Colombians and the government, or whether you're talking to some of the poorest Colombians in post-conflict areas where there's no trust. And so when a community has gotten into trouble, and you've seen that in Chocó, you were able to call government to say, help is needed here. That's a way of using privilege, and that's a way of earning trust that can be lonely at times, but it is when you are true to your word, where you show up with respect, and where you say things people don't like, because that is the only thing there is to say sometimes. You do that enough times and people kind of get a sense of who you are. And what I've found is that probably all of us have this superpower, but certainly low-income people who have been let down so many times have it. They can see if a person is real or not, 20 feet away. And so I don't think it's more complicated than that. It's stuff our grandmothers probably told us, and somehow along the line we forgot it.
Well, thank you, Virgilio. We have a lot of questions, and unfortunately we are short of time, but I'll try to combine several of them. There are several questions with regards to the future of impact investing, and also how big companies can contribute to this values renewal, and then the role of impact investing in this in the post-COVID world, and how do you see that evolving?
I mean, the good news is in this COVID world, we're all recognizing that our old systems aren't working. And so even before COVID hit, the Business Roundtable came out with a very strong statement saying that it was time to move from shareholder returns to a stakeholder model for business and for investing. And to see Larry Fink at BlackRock being a prominent voice, not only for ESG, but increasingly for integrating values into the way that we invest. These are remarkable narratives. Our challenge now as a world is to move from narrative to the examples and building from those examples so that we actually have a set of tools. I would like to see, Felipe, and believe that this is going to happen, a set of accounting principles that not only measure the financial strength of a company, but also both positive and negative, the environmental impact that a company is making on the world, the social impact, what kind of people are they employing, not just from a diversity perspective, although that's critical, but also from a skills perspective. Are we going into distressed areas? And so I really look forward and believe that the impact investing sector will help lead this, that we will see in conjunction with government, different kinds of tax policies, different kinds of overall social support policies. And this is an area where I think the Colombian government really is a partner and can be one. But where we actually make this the way business is done rather than a nice way of doing business. And that's my dream for that. And I think that COVID accelerated things that were already starting, including division and fear. But on the positive side, COVID is accelerating a move to more plant-based eating, more environmentally friendly approaches, and certainly a stakeholder model that we all know that we ignore that idea at our peril. And that makes me super hopeful.
Great. One final question. In the book, you mentioned what a life well lived. What is a life well lived?
A life well lived is, you're gonna make me cry, but it's a life that is, at the end of the day, we can do an honest assessment of ourselves and say I gave back to the world more than I took from it. That I was kind, sometimes even when I didn't feel like being kind. That I took care of other people's children, not just my own. That I listened more than I pontificated, and that I ultimately became the kind of person who people who know me might be proud to know. And what's so fascinating to me, Felipe, in getting to work, as you said, with some of the richest people on the world, on the planet, who are my friends, and some of the poorest people on the planet, who are my friends, is that we say the same things. You know, I've talked to a feudal farmer in bondage, and I was like, "What's your dream?" And he said, "I dream that one day my kids will say they're proud of me." You know, it's not that much more complicated than that, but somehow we have to remind ourselves of that. And there's never been a time to remind ourselves that all we have is each other, that we are the system, and we can decide how that system works. in ways that make us proud. And this is a moment of rebirth. And I have great hopes that Colombia can really help lead the way and certainly can show neighbors in the rest of the world, including the US, what that could look like.
Wonderful. Well, Jacqueline, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much for your time. I would also like to thank the team that helped make this happen: Carolina Gomez, Mariana Castro, Sonia Katak, and then my fellow board members, Luis Gallo, Sami Asud, and Virgilio Barco, CEO of Acumen Latin America, also very helpful. So thank you very much. And as it relates to the Aspen Institute Colombia, if you have any interest in learning more, in the email that we send, there's an address where you can request to get more information. Thank you so much, and hope you'll have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Felipe. And I hope that we can do more together with Aspen and Acumen. And I'm just so proud and excited that you all have built Aspen, and not only wish you luck, but look forward to being part of that journey too. So thank you, everyone.
And then there's a 30-second questionnaire that if you could take a minute to fill out online, it should be appearing in your screen. We would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Sammy, Luis, Virgilio, Felipe, Carolina, Juanita, Aspen, Bryn. Mucho amor.